Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. How has our day been so far? There we go. And I want to check, can everyone hear me? Yeah, because I know you can see me, right? I wear this outfit. I know you can all see me. I want to make sure you can hear me over the power suit. I'm so glad to have been your MC, and we've got an exciting close off for what's been a great set of discussions and conversations so far. And I'm sure I don't have to tell a lot of you in this room about the hype around AI. But the best performing stock on the S&P 500 so far this year is not NVIDIA. It's a company called Vistra, which is up more than 200%. It's a utility that could potentially help to fuel all the power that AI requires. And they haven't even signed a deal yet with any of the major data centers or big players like Google or Meta. It's all just on anticipation. And there's no denying that if AI takes off, that it will require a tremendous amount of energy to fuel. And so that's where our next discussion takes us. Can you invest responsibly in AI? To join us in this discussion and lead a wonderful panel, please welcome to the stage Walter Vigiluk, who's a Managing Director for Sustainable Investing at Manulife Investment Management, and his panelists. Please, a warm round of applause.
You got me hooked up with two iPads. I feel really important, or an assistant to someone important. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our thought-provoking panel discussion on the critical question, can we invest responsibly in AI? My name is Walter Vigiluk, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to moderate this really relevant, important, and growing importance conversation. So as mentioned, I'm with Manulife Investment Management, and my particular interest in this topic and with the firm is that we have been doing some work around responsible technology as a broader theme. And we believe that generative AI has been a catalyst that has now changed the technology conversation globally across sectors, and will become more ubiquitous, more universal, more systemic in nature. So as artificial intelligence continues to shape our world and reshape our businesses and the way that we work with our companies, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment. The potential of AI to drive innovation, boost productivity, and solve complex global challenges is unprecedented. Yet, with this immense potential comes equally significant risks and challenges, including serious financial, legal, and reputational risks for companies and investors. And more broadly and importantly, systemic risks for our labor market, our financial markets and financial system, and broader society. To ensure responsible technology innovation implementation, or RTII, and I know that our sustainable investment community loves additional acronyms, so I wanted to make sure we have now RTII, remember that one. We need new holistic thinking and strategies. So our discussion today, we've got an amazing panel to discuss artificial intelligence. We're gonna cover investor case for action, regulatory direction, mapping impacts of AI across the value chain, and then I think most importantly, what can investors do? So we're gonna get into all that today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the amazing panel that we have with us today. I'm gonna start with, to my left, we've got Cameron Schuler. Cameron is Chief Commercialization Officer and Vice President, Industry Innovation at the Vector Institute. Welcome, Cameron. Thanks for joining us today. To his left, we've got Sanda Ojiambo, who is the Assistant Secretary General, CEO, and Executive Director of United Nations Global Compact. Welcome, Sanda. To her left, we've got Brandon Rees, Deputy Director of Corporations and Capital Markets for the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. Welcome, Brandon. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, on the far left, we've got Jess Cairns, who's the Head of ESG and Sustainability at Alphinity Investment Management. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this conversation. To start the conversation and set the stage, I'd like to ask Cameron, if you can give us a picture of what artificial intelligence, what the conversation looks like today, what's going on in the market to get us started, please.
Thank you, I will do so. So I'm actually going to start out by telling you, you are the most important audience. Why am I saying that? Well, one of our founders of the Vector Institute received a Nobel Prize this week. So we're very proud of him, and that's actually going on right now in terms of a session, so I came here instead. So I thought this was pretty important, so it's great to be here.
Congratulations, that's no small feat.
I had nothing to do with it, but I'll pass that on. Anyhow, what I want to do is give you a little bit of history of technology in Canada, because I understand a lot of you are not from Canada. So Canada has a very long history of investing in technology. Insulin was discovered here. We were the third country to put a satellite into orbit. The CEO of CRISPR told me that the most important research in his world happened at the University of Alberta. So we start thinking about all these areas. Canada has a very long history of investing in technology that's a long way out. And AI is no different. So we've been investing in AI for more than 4 decades. And I entered the field in 2008 when there was zero commercial value, nobody cared about it, and I thought this is a fantastic place to go advance my career. But in reality, I just found it like an incredibly interesting field. So fast forward 4 years of obscurity, and Canada, having invested in it for decades, really had a very large nexus of the top talent in the world. So when I got in the field, it was estimated to be less than 200 people in the domain of AI, and they were largely in academia, and they're largely in Canada. Fast forward 4 years, and deep learning came about, so AI was actually starting to become something that you could actually use. That was discovered here in Toronto, so Jeff Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize in physics, by the way, because he also has contributed to that field. And a couple of his students were the ones that really caused the current advance that we're in. One of the other students is a guy named Ilya Sutskever, who's one of the founders of OpenAI. So Canada, and Toronto specifically, has an awful lot of contribution to what's going on. Now you fast forward in 2017, you think about a very small talent pool and lots of people in academia and lots of them in Canada. We were really at risk of losing the talent that we had. So we created something called the Pan-Canadian AI Strategy. I was one of the authors of that along with Jeff Hinton and others. And it really was, how do we make sure that Canada has the supply of talent that it needs? It's also when Vector was founded. But I wasn't actually asked to speak about all that, but I thought I would since we're here in Canada.
It's great context, thank you.
But ultimately, it's where's the world going in terms of AI? So probably 10, 11, 12 years ago, it was widely recognized that AI is going to impact every part of your life. I meet people, young and old, that say, I've never interacted with AI. If you have a smartphone, you interact with it. If you bought things off Amazon, you watch things on Netflix, you interact with it. But to me, what's really changed is the fact that computers have always forced us to work how they work. What's changed today is accessibility. You can now interact with a computer in a way that we would interact with each other, through using words. And so what this means is it's made it far more accessible. It is the enablement of the individual. So when you start thinking about how this is going to impact our lives, we already knew it was going to impact areas like medicine, education, and a whole bunch of other areas. But ultimately, it now is, how is this going to actually impact every one of us in terms of our roles? And one of the things we're hearing right now is it's always been about talent. There isn't enough talent in the world. Now it's what's going to happen to me as individuals, and we see that all the time. But I'm here to say that actually the best way to use AI is in partnership. So I'd encourage you to be using it in your daily life, whether you be using it at home, at work, within the confines of your privacy guidelines and your acceptable use policies. But I think it really is going to change the world. And so for me, again, big step change. We've gone from the computer where you had to know how to code into being able just to interact with it, ask questions, and be able to get results just by speaking or typing. That's where we are today.
Thank you, Cameron. That's great insight. I'm going to turn Brandon, Jess to you. And before I ask one of you, Brandon, I'll start with you, to share your reflections. Maybe I'll add additional framing to say, investors today, and just for you as well, we've got so many topics, we've got so many issues. The world is on fire, climate change, we're all focused on trying to solve climate change, which is a huge task in of itself. And now we've got AI sort of cropping its head and creating additional stresses, additional issues. So would love to hear about how this topic came onto your radar. When did you first take notice? Why did it become important to you? And then love to hear your reflections and thoughts on the topic to get us started, please. So maybe Brandon and Jess will go to you.
Sure, and thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to discuss this important issue. So a little bit of background, I'm with the AFL-CIO, which is the Trade Union Federation in the United States. I'm also a trustee on our pension plan as an asset owner. It's important to understand that we're on the cusp of a new industrial revolution with AI. It's on par with the invention of electricity in the way that it's going to revolutionize the future of work. And it's already here today. Our portfolio companies across industries are integrating AI into their business operations with tremendous potential impacts on the workforce and the world of work. We've seen this, it was a prominent issue in the recent port strike on the East Coast of the United States, AI-driven automation of ports. And we saw it last year with the Hollywood strikes of entertainment employees, both screenwriters as well as performers, about how AI will be integrated into their workforce. And there's been a lot of public attention to the risk of job dislocation and mass layoffs of workers being replaced by AI-driven processes. And that's an important issue, and we as responsible investors need to be talking about a just transition for the adoption of AI to ensure that the productivity gains are shared broadly within our society and we minimize disruptive impact. But there's also a second element that is less focused but of equal importance, which is the integration of AI algorithm management of the workforce, and that workers' jobs are increasingly being directed by AI algorithm and removing the human component, de-skilling of work, dehumanizing work, taking out the human judgment from the human capital management process. In its most extreme form, we've seen violations of workers' rights in terms of illegal employment discrimination by AI-driven hiring algorithms. And there are literally workers today whose jobs are controlled, the pace of their work, their quotas are being set by AI algorithms and even being terminated by such algorithms without human oversight. And that's a real potential concern. We, as investors, saw these impacts. We saw these disruptions that we were seeing in the entertainment industry, as we've seen the port strike, and more generally from our experience as an employee organization, grappling with these issues across the workplace. And so we're encouraging companies and our fellow investors on the importance of engaging with the workforce to best figure out how AI should be implemented to maximize the productivity gains and minimizing the potential social risks associated with that. And so we believe that works best through collective bargaining. The AFL-CIO, we've partnered with Microsoft to exchange information and develop best practices. But it's something that all industries, I think, would benefit from, not simply adopting AI and pushing it onto the workforce, but engaging with the workforce to figure out the best strategies for its adoption.
That's super fascinating. Sounds like a lot of layers. There's complexity involved. I would love, Jess, to hear your perspective. Do you share the same views? Is there a different perspective? And how about did this conversation get on your radar as investors?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. So I work for an asset manager based in Sydney. So we invest in listed equities in Australian index and globally. So we're coming at it from that perspective today. But 2 years ago, we started a project with the CSIRO, which is Australia's sort of premier national research agency, looking at the uptake of responsible AI in listed equities. And part of that project was to engage with 28 companies, so across Australia and globally. And we were really focused on companies that weren't necessarily developers of AI, so companies that were applying AI, so within oil and gas, the consumer sector, finance. And there was two objectives. One was to understand whether all of the messaging, I guess, to the market, which is, lots of uptake of AI is actually reality, but also whether those companies are starting to implement the sort of ethical considerations, I guess, that go around that. So the catalyst for us was probably actually 3 years ago, and it was around the same time that the ex-engineer from Google was starting to sort of talk about the risk of sentience and starting to raise the alarm. And we realised that as ESG professionals, we didn't really have a good understanding of how to analyse that risk within our ESG processes and understand what the opportunity set was. So the project with CIO really helped us to understand that component and then have also built out a framework for investors that's freely available. It's an open source toolkit to be able to kind of look at that risk. So I really agree, I think, with what everybody's said, but we sort of look at this issue through 9 different linked ESG topics. So when we think about AI, it's not a risk in itself and it's not an opportunity in itself necessarily. We agree that it's a transformational technology that's going to change how we all work, but the interface with existing ESG factors like privacy, cybersecurity, diversity and inclusion, human rights, emissions is really the way that we sort of think through how best to, understand that risk and opportunity and how best to engage and analyse the risk from a company perspective.
Super fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. Maybe, so kind of building on engaging with companies, learning what they're doing, I'm going to turn Sanda to you. You're at a unique vantage point with the UNGC. Where you've got a global perspective. You're working with corporations around the world. What are your thoughts and observations on this topic thus far?
Yeah, thank you. And just acknowledging the comments from the previous speakers, I think first and most profoundly, the acknowledgement that we have been working with AI for, from 2008 to date, if not before. So I think the ways in which we as individuals and certainly as corporations have done that continues to evolve. But at the same time, I think my reflections are that there's 2 diametrically opposed positions that exist globally, and both are true. Just saying backstage, it's very hard to stand in the middle these days on anything, but this is it. I think we have to see how we can bridge, on the one hand, the immense progress. We talked about industrial revolution, transformation, all the amazing things that we see that Gen AI and tech can do for the world, and the fact that on the other part of the world, there's people who actually don't have access to the most basic and fundamental technology. And how do we bridge that gap between these 2 immense investment opportunities, because both do stand as such? There's huge investment and opportunity to be made in advancing Gen AI in ways that is very additive to the types of economies that my panelists have spoken to. And on the other hand, there's huge investment opportunities in advancing tech and AI to drive forward sustainable investment and sustainable business around the sustainable development goals in the other half of the world. So I think our interest is really in working with corporations and actually governments and policymakers to first make sure that technology is accessible, is affordable, is equitable across the board. Secondly, that policy is enabling, puts the right incentives in the right place. And thirdly, I think for businesses to be able to leverage it in ways that advance equity, rights, and other things that have been spoken about. And then for individuals, specifically those perhaps in developing and emerging economies, to become producers of information that provides relevant content for tech and AI, and not just consumers. Because the way the world is skilled right now is the producers of content that goes into tech and AI pretty much come from one side of the world, because that's where the work, the innovation, and right now the human talent is. And that's not a problem. The issue is, how do we equalize around what this powerful technology can do for the world as a whole?
I love that. In particular, the positive aspect of the value creation across society, across business, geographically, that this technology can unlock. And I definitely think from a sustainable investment, sustainability practitioner standpoint, it's definitely the message I think we want to lead with. In particular, when we talk about technology, where technology is fast-paced, it's exciting. Nobody wants to be seen as standing in the way of technological progress. But at the same time, to your point, we want to make sure that there's some safety rails, some thoughtful planning, design that goes into it to make sure that it's ultimately going to be positive for the broader stakeholder base. So on that cheerful and positive note, I'm going to turn to one of our favorite topics, and I know everyone's going to get really excited. We're going to talk about the regulatory environment. And in particular, I'm going to start, Cameron, with you. If you can help us, to the extent you can do that in a very short time, walk us through what's going on from a regulatory standpoint globally in the different markets.
Yeah, so ultimately as investors, you want to be able to price in risk. So uncertainty doesn't help you. So you actually want certainty with your regulatory environment. if you take a look at the spectrum, everything in my world tends to be an optimization problem. So you have two extremes, you land somewhere in the middle. I would say if you look at Europe and GDPR, they've actually really stifled innovation when it comes to technology in general. Canada has some legislation proposed today. There's the executive order in the US. So it's all over the place in the world. But I would say that the important pieces for this are interoperability. So take the best from elsewhere and make sure that you're focusing on things that organizations can do around the world. Canada is 36th or 38th in terms of population and about 10th in terms of GDP in the world. So if we do something special, we may get skipped over. So ultimately, that's a pretty important part. And other pieces like ensuring that ultimately the balance between innovation, because the biggest risk is missing out on AI, and making sure that you're doing the right things for society. And I think it really needs to balance those two pieces. And a lot of it's also wrapped up in privacy as well.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing your perspective on that. What I want to turn our attention to is from a company perspective, and maybe Jess, I want to start with you. What does that look like when at the company side of things, especially if you're working at a company that's got a global footprint, and there's all these different conversations happening with different regulators?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge for us. In the Australian landscape, we don't have any regulation yet around this. So the government put out a consultation paper last year, and it seems like the model is going to be quite similar to the EU Act, which is kind of use case focused and focused around putting guardrails on the most high risk use cases like facial recognition software and like biometric data and things like that. What they've done recently is publish like a voluntary AI standard, and there's also a set of AI ethics principles which are, fairly sort of universal things around explainability, human-centered values, accountability. But to date, we aren't seeing them sort of operationalized too much within the sort of company space. And of the companies that we spoke to as part of the research, especially in the Australian market, I think there's a lot of concern around moving too quickly when regulation hasn't been put in place. So if the regulatory environment is going to be very strict, like what we're seeing in the EU, there's obviously concern that if companies are putting in place their own governance and going too far down the path, that they might have to redo things later. So there is definitely a risk that sort of by not moving too quickly, the companies are going to be behind. And the biggest issue that we have in the Australian market, I think, is that we already struggle to probably attract leading talent around technology, leading talent on our boards and some of those things. And so the wider that gap gets, it's going to sort of continue to get wider if we go down the path, similar to the EU. So that's probably what we heard, mostly as part of the research, but I think it's an area that we're looking to industry to probably take that sort of leadership position, when they can.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm picking up a couple of themes from the past two set of remarks, in particular around the speed at which this conversation is traveling. Corporations, the market doesn't want to be behind. They want to make sure taking advantage of the benefits of this technology. And at the same time, we've seen in historical context, from a regulatory perspective, the regulators struggling to get the regulations right because of the speed, the complexity of some of this technology. And so I'm wondering whether here there's a role for investors, folks in the room to play here with respect to engaging with policymakers, and what does that look like? Maybe I'll start with Sanda. I'll start with you with that question, but also if you can also talk about how you're preparing for some of these regulatory changes that have been discussed so far.
Absolutely. And let me just say that, we surveyed close to, I think, 1,500 CEOs from within our membership body. And the vast majority of them say that they are working towards including AI in their work, in their work streams, in their supply chains. They recognize the immense efficiency gains, ability to really use data more effectively for decision making and resource allocation. So very much welcome. But all of them do express the need for proper regulatory sort of guidance around what has been done. And of course, it's a global organization. So I think the way that we've looked at it, and drawing on some work that the UN Secretary General convened around a high-level advisory panel on tech and AI, is really looking at then what perhaps is the best possible global governance framework around Gen AI. Obviously, the interoperability piece is absolutely critical. The technology can speak to other technology around the world for those gains. But a couple of key points from the panel. I think first is, and outcomes from the Secretary General's advisory panel was first, the opportunity to create a global international advisory board on AI, because that actually doesn't exist. And he's been, able to pull together an advisory board that brings together private sector, academia, investors, and many others to really look at what this AI governance could look like. The other piece is also just convening policy dialogue that has government actually in there, because as we've heard, depending on the jurisdiction, government and local policymakers are going to play a key role in what it looks like in country. Other exciting things, looking at setting up an AI standards exchange. So, how do we reap the best of practice across geographies, across economies, across policymakers, and see what that looks like as well. Looking at capacity development, I talked about that. How do we train across the world so that everybody is Gen AI tech enabled to be able to deliver on this fast changing technology. Looking at creating a global fund for AI as well to address some of the inequality gaps. And then finally, actually looking at the possibility of creating a data framework so that we're all using the same vocabulary around what all of this technology means. So a lot of it is about how do we equalize but bring the best possible benefits of Gen AI and tech to the world from a global perspective. So appreciating that this means working across 193 countries. It's no easy feat, but it's really about trying to equalize, I think, the opportunities around Gen AI. So exciting to hear the progress in the various countries as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I'm going to turn, Brandon, to you, and in particular, from an investor perspective, but also one that's in a unique position to think about labor and to think about sort of the human-centric sort of aspect of this. Curious as to how you're thinking about from an engagement standpoint with regulators, how you're preparing for some of this regulation and conversation that's happening in that market.
Well, as the representative American on today's panel, the rest of the world may not have noted, but we have an election of some minor consequence happening next month that will, in many ways, determine the fate of regulation in the United States generally, and not just as it applies to artificial intelligence. You mentioned the President Biden's executive order that we were involved in consultation and the development of it. But when talking about regulation of AI in the United States, I'm reminded of the quote that's often attributed to Winston Churchill, that you can always count on America to do the right thing after we've exhausted all other possible alternatives. And I think that is certainly the case in talking about this, and that creates space for investor engagement with our portfolio companies to try to set the ethical framework and guidelines that will govern the implementation of artificial intelligence in the workplace and in companies' business operations to address some of these concerns through the private ordering process, as opposed to waiting for regulation. As we've seen with climate change, we can't wait for government to solve the problem. And we as investors can maximize the value of our portfolio companies by ensuring that they're adopting artificial intelligence in a thoughtful way that includes employee engagement and empowering workers, right? We, as a labor movement, we're not anti-technology, we're pro-worker. And we want to see technology adopted in a way that empowers workers, increases efficiency and productivity in order to provide a broad-based prosperity for all of society, as opposed to the danger and the risk that AI may be implemented in ways that are actually value-destroying and creating tremendous economic disruption to our economy. And so that's the challenge we face.
Thanks very much for sharing that perspective. I love the positive message that you'll get it right after everything's been, all the other options have been exhausted. It's a good soundbite to sort of leave off on from the political side of things. Maybe I'll take that as an opportunity to shift the conversation over to thinking about some of the impacts more broadly speaking across the value chain. We talked about some of the areas where this particular technology is impacting, but maybe I'll start. Jess, I'll start with you. In terms of thinking about the impacts across sectors, how are you assessing, how are you prioritizing that? Again, going back to my comment earlier, on top of the already big sort of task of prioritizing climate change, nature, biodiversity, human rights? How are you sort of engaging that?
This is my favorite part because I think this is the sort of most important takeaway for us from the research that we did last year, is that the impacts or the opportunities, whether we risk an opportunity, is really, really dependent on the use case, but also on the sector and on the regional context. So when we sort of, I think, went into this work, we were going into it with an assumption that we could probably draw some broad-based conclusions around, how we should think about ESG from an AI perspective. Realized quite quickly that that's not the case. Like, it really does need to be down to the specifics of the company, down to the specifics of how they're looking at AI applications. I'll give you a couple of examples. So as part of the research, we spoke to 3 different oil and gas companies, one large sort of global player, and then one sort of medium size and another sort of smaller company. So the large global company put in place a generative AI community of practice in 2013. So that was well before it was ever part of my own vocabulary. And today has over 11,000 people in that organisation that's part of that community of practice. So when ChatGPT launched, they were good to go. They, the people in the organisation understood the limits of the technology, they understood what it could be used for, they didn't have massive concerns, and they were able to start using that quite quickly within the business. They already use AI in thinking about the new energy or the energy transition and how we need to kind of use that in the more complex energy systems. They're already using it for kind of, mass data analytics using machine learning. And then, one of the other companies that we spoke to, which was one of the smaller players, isn't even really using AI for asset optimization. They're only just starting to look at like a data lake concept of sort of bringing everything together and doing that analysis. So when we think about the implications for those businesses, they're very different, right? Like the bigger company, the issues for them is around that sort of data privacy, thinking about the labour impacts and workforce, thinking about automation and transition and what it means, but also that opportunity lens on the sort of energy network. With the smaller company, let's make sure they have a policy in place. Let's make sure that they're putting up the right governance structures to sort of manage these risks, thinking about that sort of cross-functional decision-making inside of the organisation so that they are balancing, what the technology team might want to do versus what the human resources team might be concerned about. And it's similar, another example, we spoke to a whole bunch of different financial companies. So in Australia, the retail banks are really risk adverse when it comes to anything that touches the customer for quite obvious reasons. So they certainly aren't thinking about the use of AI in credit decision making, for instance, and that would be something that they would look at post regulation coming in place. But we also spoke to another fintech company in Latin America that's been doing that for over 10 years, and for them it's a inclusion story. That's about creating richer data sets that they can use to provide access for people that are generally underbanked into the banking system. So again, thinking through that use case first, or what is the application, what is the regional context, market context, and then which are the different ESG factors is quite important. So coming to your sort of second point is how we integrate that then in our own sort of practices. We have developed this kind of separate framework, but ultimately it needs to come in, against how we already look at ESG, because AI can it doesn't really create new ESG issues, I don't think. It really sort of just changes the dial probably on those different individual factors. And what we've done in a practical sense out of the research is that we have ranked companies from an AI uptake perspective, so how much AI are they actually using, and then we've ranked them on a responsible AI maturity, and then we've placed that on a matrix and overlaid with the use case risk. So what that then shows us is in the top right of that matrix, you've got companies that are very mature from a responsible AI perspective, but also have very high uptake. And then people on the bottom right are sort of low uptake. So most of the priority companies for us are in the middle of that band, where maybe the uptake is quite high, but the maturity on responsible AI is quite low. And then we put them in 3 buckets in terms of sort of active engagement, monitoring, or passive monitoring and further research from the investment team.
Thanks, Jess. That's really interesting. Thanks for the comprehensive response. It sounds like there's a lot of work that's gone into that. There's a lot of pieces. Sanda, before I turn to you, I want to invite folks from the audience to start submitting any questions you have through Slido, and then we'll have some time at the end to have a conversation and get your questions in. So maybe at this point, Sanda, I'll ask you a similar question in terms of from a global corporate perspective. You're working with many different corporations, different businesses, different sectors. How are you thinking about that prioritization question through the value chain? How are you thinking about prioritization of some of those risks? Because it's clearly a broad spectrum.
Well, absolutely. And I think there's so many exciting sectors where Gen AI can be used, from agriculture and getting more advanced in precision agriculture and using it in that way, driving forward technology, driving forward, financial inclusion. There's a whole lot of opportunities that we see in embracing Gen AI. So for us, I think it's a real opportunity, as I say, to drive forward the issues that I talked about, how you bridge this divide that exists within the world. But, you having talked about possible risks, and I'll just flag three things, and I'll just use perhaps an ESG framework to it. I think the first, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, is concerns about the energy footprint of tech and AI. And my take on that is that, we do need to, spend and use that energy to get the best that we must out of technology and the technological advancements. So it's a give and take. I think the technology around cooling and the use of data centers will also emerge to make it more efficient and effective. But I do hear that come up quite a lot of, in terms of a risk, but we have to put in to be able to get out the best of what's going to happen there. But I know that is often seen as a key concern. I think from the S piece, it's about how we can and should use technology to bridge divides, and I spoke about that earlier. And the G bit is just about the governance of it, and we've spoken about that in terms of a regulatory piece and the type of frameworks we need to put around it. I think one that I hear most often from our businesses is around jobs and skilling. And my take, and not to take away from obviously what is a real fear from many, is also to focus on the fact that Gen AI in and of itself may not take away jobs, but the person with the Gen AI skills would probably take your job away. Right. So that puts the focus more on skilling up people and not worrying about technology, because the technology already exists. It's existed for ages. So let's put the focus more on getting people the right skills, the right knowledge, the right opportunities to use and exploit data better. For me, that would be, and that's probably the most pervasive thing that we hear about in terms of risks, concerns, and worries from business and private sector.
That's a really great message, and I think it reminds me, I've seen some charts where we've got a lot of technologies over the last 100 years that were a part of our daily life, whether it's work life, home life, that are today obsolete. And so I guess that's just a factor of change. So as long as it's done in a way that we try to minimize and think through as much as possible the unintended consequences, the impacts on the stakeholders. It sounds like to me that's one of the really positive takeaways of how to think about this. Brendan, I know we talked a little about this with your last response, but I'll give you a chance to, if you want to have any additional comments on this particular question yourself.
Yes, so at the beginning of the panel, you asked how we first became attentive to AI risk as an investor, and I mentioned that it was in response to the Hollywood strike by entertainment workers and the use of AI in that industry. In response, our AFL-CIO equity index funds, which are a collective investment trust of union members' pension plans in the U.S., developed a shareholder proposal. The shareholder proposal process in North America is, critically important component of our corporate governance fabric. It allows investors to bring forward new and emerging issues to the board and our fellow investors to be almost an early warning system. And we developed a new shareholder proposal seeking transparency around AI, how these businesses are planning to incorporate artificial intelligence and how they're managing the risks that are incumbent with this new technology. And we filed a number of these shareholder proposals that were very positively received by the marketplace. We got a 38% vote in favor of our AI transparency shareholder proposal at Apple Computer. We got a 43% vote at Netflix. And more importantly, we were able to negotiate withdrawals of the proposal at Comcast, at Disney, and at Fox, in which those companies agreed to enhance their sustainability reporting to investors to disclose how they're using AI, how they're thinking about AI, what ethical guardrails they've put in place surrounding it, and how are they engaging with their workforce to best determine how it should be implemented in the workplace. And we thought that was a critical development. And from our experience in talking to these companies, which are not tech companies per se, but are implementing AI, generative AI platforms, they were really just starting to think about how this, to be honest, I wasn't sure if they were thinking about these issues before we engaged with them. And so that's the opportunity that we as responsible investors can do. Everyone in this room, you can go back and check how your fund voted on our shareholder proposals at Apple Computer, and have you adopted a policy for engagement for your stewardship teams and raising these issues for companies. And from our standpoint, governance is really critical, right? What is the role of the board of directors in monitoring AI-related risks? Where does that sit? Is it in the the audit committee responsible for cybersecurity? Is it a board-level function? And what engagement is the company doing with its workforce around these questions?
Yeah, that's super helpful. And that's actually a great segue into the next section of our conversation, which is really around what can investors do to start taking action. And I know we've touched on that through the conversations so far, but sort of looking out into the room, there's a lot of different investors here. They're at varying stages of their own journey or their own thinking around this particular topic. So maybe where I'd like to start is maybe on the governance side, so spend a bit more time on that. Cameron, I'll go to you. We haven't heard from you for a while, so. In particular, what are some of the fundamental steps investors should take to approach the issue from your perspective when it comes to the governance around artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so just for context, our industrial partners, which I'm responsible for, employ millions of people, and their revenues are in the hundreds of millions collectively, and they're global multinationals through to companies with 10 people. So we see across the spectrum. And ultimately, the interesting change for me has been, if you look at the ESG, G has just been elevated by a multiple, right? And it's investors saying, our boards making sure that the companies are taking advantage of AI, because we want to make sure that we don't miss out. But we also want to make sure that we're doing the right things. And so what would those right things be? Certainly things like education, how people are able to use it and how they're not. And we see the spectrum. We work with a lot of regulated industries. So we've seen them all the way from you can't touch it for work through to we have a privacy policy, so don't violate that. And as long as you're not putting private things in the public domain, that works. So it's fairly broad across the spectrum, but it's 100%. Their biggest risk is not participating. And then when you think about governance, the analog I would draw would be cybersecurity, right? So if you think about what you need on your board, you need people that are literate, right? And so lots of boards don't have people that are cybersecurity experts, but the questions, you need to be informed enough to say, do you have it under control, and how do you know? How can you tell me you have it under control? So you start balancing that risk piece. One of the other things that's incredibly important is institutions have long institutional knowledge. So when you're going to go do something, business objective, business goal, you're generally on the same page with everyone inside the organization. But since AI is a new practice for many different people, you need to make sure you have larger teams when you do these things. So why is this important? It's really important to make sure that everyone is marching in the same direction. You're trying to achieve the same goals. And ultimately, when you think about it from a board perspective, because I'll use that as synonymous for the governance side, it really is making sure that there's reasonable oversight and that you don't see the risk as completely innumerable, right? Ultimately, you want it innumerable. You really want it to be something where you define how you're going to use it, and then you can actually define the risks based on the particular use case and where it fits into the business. Otherwise, you can spend an awful lot of time on things that are such edge cases, you probably don't need to spend the time there. But if you distill it down to how are you going to use it, what's the business outcome you need, then you can actually say, all right, what are the risks associated with this particular environment? And it's building that in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think fundamentally, the board members, the people involved in the conversations really need to get a better understanding of these issues to be able to properly assess, monitor, manage them, and work with the board, with the management team to manage these issues over time. I know that each of your organizations has put out some really useful either frameworks or white paper. Would love to kind of get you to talk a little bit more about that as a potential resource for folks in the audience. Maybe Jess, I'll go to you, and if you can share a bit more about your perspective around the governance piece of it, and then also on some of the additional experiences maybe that you've had on engaging on these issues with boards or sort of senior management as well. So pass it to you, then we'll kind of make the rounds. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And I should have mentioned in my response earlier as well, which I forgot, that so as part of the sort of conversations, we basically met with CTOs or equivalent within organisations, and we sort of spent 60 minutes and asked them, all the questions around how they're using AI and thinking about ethics. And one of the questions that we asked was which sort of ESG factors they felt were most relevant to the uptake of AI. And nearly all of them said data privacy and cybersecurity, which sort of makes sense when you think about their area in the business. And so this was 18 months ago when we did these interviews. Not one mentioned emissions or climate, which I find so interesting now, because 18 months on, they would definitely say that, because since then we've had this, obviously boom in terms of data centres and the investment case around all of that, and there's a lot more talk. They also really didn't mention a lot around that human capital and labour impacts. So I think that as a risk, and a lot of these companies use words like augmentation or human in the loop, and some of those terms, so quite downplaying, I guess, where some of those potential risks and issues can be. So that feels like a bit of a gap in terms of that sort of policy awareness. But the framework that we have published, so like I said, we've put a report out there, which you'll find on our website, and also a toolkit that's an open source resource for investors to use, and there's 3 parts to it. So the first is a use case analysis. We've identified 27 key use cases across 9 different sectors, and then we've done a preliminary E&S kind of materiality assessment, and also flagged that against the EU AI Act, which is what the CSIRO team really did for us, and then gives you a preliminary kind of levelling, I guess, in terms of the risk area of those use cases. But again, the idea is obviously that this is a tool that investors can use to do their own analysis. And then part 2 is a governance assessment, looking at 10 key governance indicators. And then the third is like a deep dive review that you would look to do for, some of really high risk companies or areas that you might have concern. And, the idea is here that investors can use the 3 parts together as a process. So you can do use case, governance, and then deep dive, or you can use bits and pieces of it. So if you're a larger investor that needs to screen across thousands of companies, probably doing all 3 parts doesn't make sense, but maybe looking at the use case risk profile by sector and then doing some like spot checks on the governance, would be a practical way to sort of go forward. And the governance indicators, I think, are quite useful. We've mentioned a few of them here already, but, includes things like board accountability, having specific guardrails around high-risk use cases or sensitive use cases, depending on how we define that, if there's a policy. So at the moment, the companies that we spoke to, a lot of them had internal frameworks, but only 10% actually published responsible AI policy. So that's a really logical, first thing that we'd like to see. Things like have they started engaging with their workforces? Do they have programs around that to get that skill and uptake? Do they track and report incidents to boards? So are they actually flagging where an AI model or whatever it is has gone wrong and actually reporting that up the line? And that's quite limited at the moment. We're not seeing that at all. And then do we think that the AI systems are being integrated in existing processes as opposed to sitting off on the side? So yeah, those indicators, are useful. And I think for us, we've, started to implement this now since we published earlier this year and have found it, a useful framework.
Thanks so much, Jess. Brandon, I'm gonna go to you, and you talked about proxy voting and some of the results that and experiences you've had. Maybe you can expand on that by talking a bit more whether you're doing some additional engagement on top of that proxy voting activity. What are those engagements looking like? And also, what tools are you seeing that are available for investors to take action as well?
And I'll try to be brief since I know we're running short on time. But the first thing I would say is that asset owners and asset managers should look to collaborative engagement because this is a new issue affecting all industries, and so we need to maximize our own limited resources. The AFL-CIO Equity Index Funds, we co-filed our shareholder proposals in collaboration with the New York City retirement system. earlier this year. That's one way to do it. And in terms of resources, looking to those resources that investor organizations are putting forward. And I just highlight one. Last month, the IRC, which is the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility in the United States, published a new guide for engagement on digital technology and low-wage workers. And it's a very helpful resource to identifying questions that we as investors should be asking our portfolio companies to help minimize these risks and to maximize the potential positive impact that AI promises.
Great, thank you. I know we're running short on time. That's totally on me as the moderator. I was just so enamored by the conversation. I'll pick the obvious question here, which is the one that's got the most upvotes. And if somebody wants to jump in, please go ahead. Can you speak to how investors should evaluate heavy AI use corporates whose carbon transition goals were set well before their scope 2 emissions have now exponentially grown? Any one of you want to take that one on?
I can certainly take it.
Thanks, Cameron.
I think, what we see, we work with partners all the time. So one of our telcos actually created a published open source data code repository on how to reduce cooling costs in your data center. So I think AI will be a piece of that answer. We have another startup that came out of our research community that will actually take a look at what you're trying to accomplish, evaluate the different models you would use and pick the most efficient model, so you're using less of that. And over time, what I think we'll see is compute becoming more efficient. So currently the models are absolutely enormous, but over time, as you see things that need to be more specialized, they'll be smaller. And you can buy an NVIDIA chip that'll sit on your floor that you can run a large language model off of at this point in time and train. So I think technology will solve a number of these problems. And I think over time, that's really what's going to make the difference.
That sounds great. I think that's all we have time for today. So I want to thank our esteemed panel for being here with us today, for sharing perspectives, and for discussing what is probably going to be an even bigger topic next year. So thank you very much. If you can join me with a round of applause.